Welcome to Pentecost 8, and it's lovely to be back with you after nearly a month and a half of being away and being very busy over the last little while, but beautiful to be back with you and lovely to be sitting here with Karen. How are you, Karen?
Yes, I'm very well, thanks, Linda. I'm looking forward to working with you for the next 3 weeks.
Yes, lovely, and we've come into an interesting time. We're at Pentecost 8 now, and the scriptures this week were very interesting around Samuel and Ephesians, and then the Markian text on Jesus with a bit of a gap there in the actual lectionary reading, but we'll probably fill in that gap because it's an important part of the story and the chronology of it all. So, just finished NAIDOC week, and this month has been a month about thinking about people other than ourselves, and certainly people from other cultures, our own Indigenous people, but broader than that in the world context. And the scriptures especially from Samuel today, are talking a bit about in and out. You know, where do we hold God? Can God and the scriptures stay in a tent which is open in a shepherding type way to everyone, or do we want to put God in a box and a house and a building? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Karen?
Well, yes, it seems David's wanting to give God the very best and give him a cedar mansion. And, you know, we know that eventually Solomon, you know, gave God a beautiful palace, but then barred everyone except the high priest from having access. So we want to give God the glory, and last week's Ephesians reading, you know, spoke of us giving God the glory, but we also, we hope that God is available for everyone. So, you know, it's something we can be aware of and wrestle with a bit, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're quite good at taking the seed of something and making it into something else. But there's resistance from the prophet Nathan about sensing that God didn't really want to be put in a house or a palace or some construction.
Yes. And just, you know, trying to get a handle on what God really does want for us. There's a sense that God wasn't that impressed about having a king in the first place, but because that's what the people wanted, God went along with that and helped Israel, you know, find their identity with God through the structure that we ended up with. Yeah.
Yes, and there's a very strong pull, social political pull there about making Jerusalem the place where God was, and it's almost the beginning of government, really, that centering of one place where the power is held. We're clever people.
But there's always this God calls them back to righteousness and justice, and there's a long history of Israel straying and, you know, getting caught up in all sorts of things of humans, but God always showing steadfast love and drawing them back to God's self. So we see that with Jesus much later, calling all people to God's self, and, you know, Jesus incarnating the justice and love and compassion and peace and joy and hope that is in God. So while we think of it as a bit separate, it is actually a lot more continuous than what we sometimes think of. So it's important that we do have a look at the Old Testament readings fairly regularly, because that's the basis upon which the Christian church is, you know, initially the stories that it's drawn upon.
Yes, definitely. And it's interesting too that in the Ephesians reading this time, it's almost harking back to the time of, you know, God as in community, and rather than in a temple or a synagogue or a space. So there is absolutely so much we can learn from the Hebrew scriptures, and the story along the path. We were talking before about stories, weren't we, Karen, and the importance of that narrative in helping us to express who we are and how we understand things, and even helping us to have compassion for others as we listen to their stories.
Absolutely. And so while it's important to tell our own stories, it's also really important to be able to hear people's stories and to listen well. I do really like this Ephesians reading that we've had today. It reminds us of the struggles that the early church had. There were the group of people with the Jewish tradition behind them, and they had all these rites and rituals and things that they had to do. But there's also an awareness that, God was there for the Gentiles as well. And there was pretty much a sense of us and them. And you get the sense from the letter to the Ephesians that there's some hostilities between the people. And so the person that's attributed to Paul, scholars think it's likely someone a bit later writing in Paul's name, writes about the peace and the power of God's reconciling love that's in Jesus. And I'm reminded of it's a setup in the north of Ireland. It's called Coromila, and it was set up by a fellow who was captured in World War II and was in Dresden while the bombing happened. And when he went back to the north of Ireland, he just couldn't understand why they had all these hostilities when, everyone, they were Christians, but the Protestants and the Catholics had this great enmity and violence towards one another. And so he set up this, it was like a household where people could come and hear each other. And it was open to people of all diverse nationalities and religions, and anyone, or sexuality, anyone could come and listen to each other. And it's been going then since, just after World War II. And, there's been some awful violence and atrocities in the north of Ireland. But what this place does is it makes it safe for people to come and hear each other's stories. And, one lady came with a hatchet because she just didn't know what was going to happen there. She was just really frightened to be out of where she was, but it wasn't safe, to be where she was. And, it's a place where the hatchet got put down, and people of, who had been enemies began to hear each other. There's one story where a woman just couldn't cope and left the room. And when she came back, another lady said, "I go to the bathroom to cry too." And it really just broke the tenseness of that conversation, that we're humans in this together, and that we're one in Christ in all of this. And if we can listen to each other's stories and hear each other's hurt and pain, and ask for forgiveness for the wrongs we've done, and give that forgiveness when we are wronged, there is the possibility that God's peace can reside within us once more.
Yes.
And rather than being burdened by pain and hurt and the things that hostilities do to us, we can be open to God's saving grace and love. So I think the Ephesians offers a lot of possibility for any of us who are feeling hostility towards others, or even other racial groups or anything, that Christ is the one who reconciles, and we're part of that in the body of Christ.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And on the podcast this week too, they were saying about the peace that is offered, and I think they said 4 times peace is used in this particular passage, but it's not just the peace of shalom, a welcoming or a farewelling, that sort of peace be with you, go with you. The peace be with you, which is what we often say in church, is more about, the light in me recognises the light in you, a bit like namaste in the Indian tradition. It's a very deep connection with peace, and it can only come from God, because we're infallible, and we get caught up in our own stuff often.
We sure do.
A lot of it's fear, isn't it? I think just about everything's fear, and there's something about sitting down with someone and listening and talking with that the hatchet gets put down, as you said.
Yeah,
Your protective devices get dropped once you start to connect with a person and understand them a bit better.
Yeah. But it does take, at times it's really hard to listen. We get caught up in our own anger and frustration, and if someone's, we think's being a bit aggressive, it's quite a turnaround to say, oh, but what's going on for you that you're so confrontational today, and give them the opportunity to voice their frustrations and hurts, because the more we can hear each other, the more we can be community together, and it's in community that we have strength
absolutely,
and possibilities. The reading from Ephesians last week had it's really had a liturgical sense of praise the glory of God, praise the glory of God. I think that had like a fourfold pattern too. And now we're getting further into Ephesians. We're hearing why we're praising God. God gave us Jesus to show us what God's peace looks like. And
it's not always a comfortable peace, is it? Or our peace can cause discomfort for others.
That's right. When you want to stand up for some justice, some people get a bit put out by that.
Definitely.
And even acknowledging the traditional owners, some people find that hard to hear. But we're gifted with the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gather, and this is we've just had NAIDOC week, and we talk about healing our country. And part of that healing of the country is to actually listen to the stories of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, and stand with them in solidarity for the pain of not knowing all their stories anymore because they've not been able to tell them. We there's a lot of richness that we're missing out on at the moment, but they're offering to us this possibility to hear their stories and help them share their stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I got the opportunity to listen to a panel of Indigenous people recently through the University of Divinity, and it was just beautiful listening to them talking about their connectedness, their belief in connectedness with everything, that the kangaroo is their brother and the trees are their sisters, and that connected, and the honouring of whatever they do with the land or with the animals. I mean, it might kill them to eat them, but in a respectful and honouring way that's sustainable, and they've done it for 60,000 years, and we've got so much to learn from them. But there's something about letting go of a lot for those of us who aren't the Indigenous people. We pull from all of our different backgrounds and experiences and how we've been taught, and there's a lot of good in that, but there's a lot that we can learn.
Absolutely. We're always open to learning, aren't we, Linda?
Definitely. Habitual student.
I've got a little poem that I thought might be nice to finish us off with.
Great.
It's called, going back to the story of Corrymeela in the north of Ireland, or Northern Ireland. It's quite, it's a poem of hope, I think. It is both a dignity and a difficulty to live between these names, perceiving politics in the syntax of the state. And at the end of the day, the reality is that whether we change or whether we stay the same, these questions will remain. Who are we to be with one another? And how are we to be with one another? And what to do with all those memories of all those funerals? And what about those present whose past was blasted far beyond their future? I wake, you wake, she wakes, he wakes, they wake. We wake and take this troubled beauty forward. I think that's a good one to close with.
Absolutely, and may the peace of Christ be with us as we go forward.
Indeed.